Sarah Matthews had lived in Millbrook her entire 26 years, but on that cold October morning, the town felt like a foreign place. The wooden stocks in the town square had been dusted off and reinforced, a relic from colonial times that hadn't seen use in over a century. Today, they would hold her. The crowd gathered early, their faces a mix of anger, disappointment, and morbid curiosity. These were people who had known Sarah since childhood, who had watched her grow up as the daughter of the town's beloved librarian. Mrs. Henderson, who used to slip her extra cookies at the bakery, now glared with cold eyes. Tom Morrison, who had taught her to fish at Miller's Pond, shook his head in disgust. "Thief!" someone shouted from the crowd. "She stole from the church fund! Betrayed us all!" The accusations hit Sarah like physical blows. Her legs trembled as Sheriff Garrett led her toward the stocks, the iron shackles cold against her wrists. The evidence against her had been overwhelming, or so it seemed. The stolen money from the church restoration fund had been found hidden in her cottage, wrapped in a cloth that bore her initials. Her own handwriting on deposit slips showed she had been the last person to handle the donations before they disappeared. "I didn't do this," Sarah whispered to the sheriff, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. "You know me, Sheriff. You know I would never steal from the church." Sheriff Garrett's weathered face showed no emotion. He had been a friend of her father's, had attended her high school graduation, had even helped her move into her small cottage when she turned 18. But duty was duty, and the evidence was clear. "The court has made its decision, Sarah. You've been found guilty of theft and breach of public trust. The sentence is public humiliation and permanent marking." The permanent marking. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought. In Millbrook, serious crimes weren't just punished with jail time. Following an old tradition that the town council had voted to reinstate 5 years ago, convicted criminals were branded with a single letter on their forearm. A T for thief, a L for liar, a M for murderer. The brand would fade over time but would always leave a visible scar, a permanent reminder of shame. As Sarah was forced to kneel beside the stocks, her mind raced back to the events that had led to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been working her usual shift at the town hall, where she served as the part-time record keeper. The church restoration fund had been her responsibility, a task she had taken on gladly when Father McKenna had asked for volunteers. The old stone church needed extensive repairs to its roof and foundation, and the entire community had contributed generously. She remembered the day the money disappeared. It had been a Tuesday, and she had just finished counting the latest batch of donations. The fund had grown to nearly $15,000, more money than many of the townspeople saw in a year. She had carefully recorded each contribution, placed the cash in the designated envelope, and locked it in the safe, just as she had done dozens of times before. The next morning, the money was gone. Sheriff Garrett had investigated thoroughly, questioning everyone who had access to the building. The safe showed no signs of forced entry, and only 3 people knew the combination: Sarah, Mayor Williams, and the sheriff himself. Security cameras had been installed recently, but they had malfunctioned the night of the theft, showing nothing but static during the crucial hours. When the money was found in Sarah's cottage, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, her fate was sealed. Her protests of innocence fell on deaf ears. The evidence was too compelling, too neat. The cloth bearing her initials, the handwriting samples, the fact that she was the only one who could have taken the money without forcing the safe. It all pointed to her guilt. Now, as the blacksmith prepared the branding iron in a small brazier beside the stocks, Sarah felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her. These people had been her neighbors, her friends, her extended family. She had helped organize their festivals, had babysat their children, had mourned with them during difficult times. Now they watched with satisfaction as she was about to be marked as a criminal. "Sarah Matthews," announced Mayor Williams, reading from an official document. You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of theft of public funds and breach of public trust. You are hereby sentenced to 1 hour in the stocks, followed by permanent marking and banishment from participation in all town activities for a period of 5 years. The crowd murmured its approval. Someone threw a rotten tomato that splattered against the wooden stocks beside her head. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the humiliation, trying to find some source of strength within herself. "I know what you all think," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying across the square. "I know the evidence looks bad, but I swear to you, on my father's grave, on everything I hold sacred, I did not steal that money. Someone else did this, and they're letting me take the blame." "Liar!" shouted someone from the back of the crowd. "Enough talk," called another voice. "Brand her and be done with it." As the iron grew red-hot in the brazier, Sheriff Garrett approached with heavy steps. In his hand was a wooden handle attached to an iron rod, at the end of which glowed the letter T in reverse, ready to be pressed into Sarah's skin. "I'm sorry about this, Sarah," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "But the law is the law." Sarah bit down on the leather strap they had given her and braced herself for the pain. The crowd fell silent, watching with rapt attention as the sheriff lifted the branding iron. The smell of heated metal filled the air. Just as the iron was about to touch her forearm, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Someone was shouting, pushing through the gathered townspeople with urgent determination. "Wait! Stop! Don't do this!" All heads turned toward the disturbance. Through the crowd came Marcus Stone, a man Sarah barely knew but had seen around town occasionally. He was in his 30s, tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. She had heard he was some kind of tracker or investigator who helped find lost pets and missing persons. People called him the Hunter because of his ability to track down anything or anyone. "I said stop!" Marcus shouted again, finally breaking through to the front of the crowd. He was breathing hard, his clothes dusty from travel, and he carried a leather satchel that looked well used. Sheriff Garrett lowered the branding iron, his expression shifting from resignation to confusion. "Marcus, what's this about? The trial is over. Justice must be served." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes meeting Sarah's for just a moment. In them, she saw something she hadn't seen in weeks: doubt about her guilt. "Sheriff," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent square, "I have reason to believe that Sarah Matthews is innocent. Give me 5 minutes to explain what I've discovered, and I think you'll agree that this branding should be postponed." The crowd erupted in protests and demands for the ceremony to continue, but Sheriff Garrett raised his hand for silence. He was a fair man, despite his stern exterior, and if there was even a chance that an innocent person was about to be marked for life, he needed to hear what Marcus had to say. "You've got 5 minutes, the sheriff said, setting the branding iron aside. "But this better be good, Marcus. We've got 100 people here who want to see justice done." Marcus opened his leather satchel and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "Sheriff, 3 days ago, Mrs. Hendricks hired me to find her missing cat. While I was searching the woods behind the old Morrison farm, I discovered something that changes everything about this case." He held up a photograph that made Sarah's heart race with hope. Even from her position in the stocks, she could see that it showed something important, something that might prove her innocence. "This," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, "is evidence that the real thief is still walking free among us. And if you give me the chance to explain what I found, I can prove that Sarah Matthews has been framed." The crowd pressed closer, their bloodlust for justice now mixed with curiosity about this unexpected development. Sarah felt tears of hope streaming down her face as she looked up at this stranger who might be her salvation. Sheriff Garrett glanced at the crowd, then at the branding iron cooling in the brazier, then back at Marcus. "All right," he said finally. "5 minutes. But if this turns out to be nothing more than a delay tactic, we're going ahead with the sentence." Marcus nodded grimly. "Sheriff, when I'm done explaining what I found, you're going to realize that we almost made a terrible mistake today, and the person who really stole that money is standing somewhere in this very crowd, watching us right now." A murmur of unease rippled through the gathered townspeople as they began to look at each other with new suspicion. Sarah's heart pounded with desperate hope as she waited to hear whether this mysterious hunter had truly found the evidence that could save her from a lifetime of shame. Marcus Stone had always possessed an unusual gift for seeing what others missed. As a child, he could find his grandmother's lost jewelry when everyone else had given up searching. As a teenager, he had tracked down a neighbor's stolen bicycle by following clues that the police had overlooked. Now, at 34, he made his living as a private investigator specializing in cases that required careful observation and methodical tracking. When Mrs. Hendricks had approached him about her missing cat, Whiskers, Marcus had expected a simple job. The elderly woman was distraught, explaining that her beloved orange tabby had been gone for 4 days. She lived near the edge of town, where her property backed up to the old Morrison farm that had been abandoned for years. Marcus began his search in the usual manner, checking obvious hiding spots and asking neighbors if they had seen the cat. It was while examining the wooded area behind Mrs. Hendricks's house that he noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks led from the main road into the woods, following an old logging trail that supposedly hadn't been used in years. The tracks were recent, made within the past week by a vehicle with distinctive tread patterns that Marcus photographed carefully. More importantly, the tracks led to a small clearing where someone had obviously spent considerable time recently. Cigarette butts littered the ground, all of the same brand. Empty food containers suggested multiple visits. Someone had been using this secluded spot as a regular meeting place or hideout. It was pure chance that led Marcus to his most important discovery. While photographing the tire tracks, he noticed something metallic glinting in the underbrush about 20 feet from the clearing. Investigating further, he found a small metal cash box, partially buried under fallen leaves and debris. The box was unlocked, and inside, Marcus discovered several items that made his blood run cold. Bank deposit slips bearing the header of Millbrook Community Church. A notebook with handwriting practice that showed someone carefully copying Sarah Matthews' signature over and over again. Most damning of all, a photograph of Sarah's cottage with detailed notes about her daily schedule, including the times she left for work and when she typically returned home. Marcus immediately realized he was looking at evidence of an elaborate frame-up, but he needed more proof before approaching the authorities. He spent the next 2 days conducting careful surveillance and investigation, following the tire tracks and methodically documenting everything he found. The tracks led him to several locations around town, including a spot near Sarah's cottage where the vehicle had been parked for extended periods. Soil samples from the tire tracks contained distinctive red clay that Marcus knew came from only one location in the area, the construction site, where the new municipal building was being erected. This led Marcus to focus his investigation on people connected to the construction project. The municipal building contract was worth nearly $500,000, and Marcus discovered that there had been significant cost overruns that the contractor was struggling to cover. The project was behind schedule, and penalty clauses in the contract meant the contractor was facing serious financial difficulties. Through careful research at the county clerk's office, Marcus learned that the contractor, Robert Fleming, had been having financial problems for months. His construction company owed money to suppliers, and there had been liens filed against several of his projects. The church restoration fund money would be exactly the amount needed to keep his business afloat until the municipal project was completed. But Marcus needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed proof that would convince Sheriff Garrett and the townspeople that Sarah was innocent. So he did what he did best. He watched and waited. For 2 nights, Marcus maintained surveillance on the clearing in the woods where he had found the cash box. His patience was rewarded on the 2nd night when a pickup truck arrived at midnight, following the same tire tracks he had been investigating. Robert Fleming emerged from the truck, followed by his nephew Danny, a young man in his 20s who had worked various odd jobs around town. Marcus watched from his concealed position as the 2 men met with a 3rd person whose identity made everything clear: Janet Morrison, the church treasurer and the only other person besides Sarah who had regular access to the donation records. From his hiding place, Marcus could hear portions of their conversation. Janet was nervous, worried that the investigation might eventually point to her. Fleming reassured her that Sarah's trial was over and the matter would be closed once the branding was completed. Danny seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation, suggesting they should come forward with the truth. "She's going to be marked for life," Danny protested. "That's not right. She's innocent." "She's nobody," Janet replied coldly. "A part-time clerk with no family, no real connections. Better her than us." Fleming nodded agreement. "The money saved my business and got Janet out of her gambling debts. Sarah will survive the shame. We might not survive prison." Marcus documented the entire conversation with a small recording device, but he needed more evidence to ensure his findings would be believed. Over the next day, he conducted additional investigation that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Janet Morrison had been embezzling small amounts from various church accounts for over a year to cover gambling debts that had spiraled out of control. When the restoration fund grew to $15,000, the temptation became too great. She approached Fleming, who agreed to help her steal the money in exchange for a portion to cover his construction company's debts. The plan was elaborate and carefully executed. Janet used her access to church records to create false documentation that would implicate Sarah. She practiced copying Sarah's handwriting for weeks, creating convincing forgeries of deposit slips and financial records. Fleming's nephew Danny, who had a crush on Sarah but had been too shy to approach her, was coerced into helping by gathering information about her daily routine and finding ways to plant evidence in her cottage. The security camera malfunction hadn't been accidental. Danny, who had some technical knowledge, had been assigned to disable the system on the night of the theft. The timing was perfect. Sarah had counted and secured the donations on Tuesday afternoon. Janet had returned that evening to steal the money, and the evidence was planted in Sarah's cottage the following day while she was at work. Marcus realized that the conspiracy involved 3 people, each with their own motivation for framing an innocent woman. Janet needed the money to pay gambling debts and saw Sarah as an expendable scapegoat. Fleming needed cash to save his failing business and was willing to destroy someone's life to get it. Danny had been manipulated through a combination of family pressure and threats, though Marcus suspected the young man was having serious second thoughts about his participation. Now, standing before the crowd in the town square with the evidence in his hands, Marcus prepared to reveal the truth that would save Sarah from a lifetime of shame and expose the real criminals who had been hiding among them. Sheriff Garrett looked at the photograph Marcus held up, his expression growing increasingly serious. "What exactly am I looking at, Marcus?" "This is a photograph of a cash box I found buried in the woods behind the old Morrison farm," Marcus explained, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "Inside this box, I found practice sheets where someone had been copying Sarah's handwriting, along with church deposit slips and detailed surveillance notes about Sarah's daily schedule." A murmur of confusion and concern rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she listened to Marcus methodically present his findings. "I also found tire tracks leading to and from this location, tracks that I was able to follow to several spots around town, including a location near Sarah's cottage where someone had been conducting surveillance. Soil analysis showed these tracks contained red clay that comes from only one location in Millbrook, the new municipal construction site. Sheriff Garrett stepped closer, his hand extended. "Let me see that evidence." Marcus handed over the folder containing photographs, documents, and soil samples. As the sheriff examined the contents, his face grew pale with understanding. "There's more," Marcus continued. "I conducted surveillance of the burial site for 2 nights. On the second night, I witnessed a meeting between the real perpetrators of this crime. I have recorded evidence of their conversation admitting to framing Sarah Matthews." The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising in confusion and anger. Sarah remained locked in the stocks, afraid to hope, but feeling the first stirrings of vindication after weeks of despair. "Who?" demanded Mayor Williams. "Who are you accusing?" Marcus reached into his satchel and pulled out a small digital recorder. "The 3 people responsible for stealing the church restoration fund and framing Sarah Matthews are standing in this crowd right now, and I have their confession recorded right here." As Marcus held up the recorder, Sarah noticed movement in the crowd. Near the back, someone was pushing through the gathered townspeople trying to reach the edge of the square. It was Danny Fleming, his face white with panic. "Sheriff," Marcus called out, pointing toward the fleeing figure. "You might want to stop that young man before he gets away. He's one of the 3 conspirators, and I suspect he's about to try to run." Sheriff Garrett immediately signaled to his deputy, who moved to intercept Danny at the edge of the crowd. The young man didn't resist, seeming almost relieved as he was taken into custody. "Now," Marcus said, pressing the play button on the recorder, "let me share with you the conversation I recorded 2 nights ago. I think you'll find it very enlightening." The crowd fell completely silent as Janet Morrison's voice emerged from the small speaker, cold and calculating as she discussed the frame-up of an innocent woman. The recording was clear enough that everyone could hear her admit to the theft and her callous dismissal of Sarah's suffering. As the recording played, Sarah watched in amazement as the truth finally emerged. The townspeople who had been calling for her branding just minutes earlier now looked shocked and ashamed. In the crowd, she could see Janet Morrison trying to edge away, but several neighbors had recognized her voice and were blocking her path. When Robert Fleming's voice joined the conversation on the recording, admitting his role in the conspiracy and his financial motives, another commotion erupted as people in the crowd identified the construction contractor and prevented his escape. Sheriff Garrett stopped the recording and looked out over the crowd with a grim expression. "Janet Morrison, Robert Fleming, step forward now. You're both under arrest for theft, conspiracy, and fraud." The crowd parted as the 2 conspirators were reluctantly pushed forward by their neighbors. The expressions of shock and betrayal on the faces of the townspeople were evident as they realized how completely they had been deceived. The silence that followed Sheriff Garrett's announcement was deafening. Sarah remained locked in the stocks, hardly daring to believe that her nightmare might finally be ending. The crowd, which had gathered with such certainty about her guilt, now stood in stunned confusion as they processed the magnitude of the deception that had nearly led to the branding of an innocent woman. Janet Morrison stood frozen near the center of the square, her face a mask of defiance even as the evidence of her guilt mounted around her. She had been the church treasurer for 15 years, trusted by everyone in the community. Her family had helped found Millbrook 3 generations ago, and her reputation had been spotless until this moment. "This is ridiculous," Janet said, her voice shaking but still attempting authority. "You can't possibly believe some stranger over the evidence. The money was found in her cottage. Her handwriting was on the deposit slips." Marcus stepped forward, his expression calm but determined. "Your handwriting, actually. The handwriting you practiced for weeks until you could forge Sarah's signature well enough to fool a casual examination. I found 17 practice sheets in that buried cash box, along with detailed notes about Sarah's schedule that you used to plan when to plant the evidence." Sheriff Garrett was studying the contents of Marcus's folder with increasing gravity. The soil samples, the photographs, the handwriting practice sheets, And most damning of all, the recorded confession painted a picture of conspiracy that was impossible to ignore. "Janet," the sheriff said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I've known you since we were children. Your father was my best friend. How could you do this?" For the first time, Janet's composure cracked. Tears began streaming down her face as the weight of her actions became clear. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "The gambling started small. Just a little fun at the casino an hour away. But then I lost more than I could afford. And the people I owed money to weren't patient. They threatened me, threatened my family." Robert Fleming, still trying to maintain his innocence despite the recorded evidence, stepped forward aggressively. "This is all circumstantial. Some tire tracks and a recording that could have been faked. You can't convict people based on the word of someone who makes his living chasing lost cats." Marcus remained calm in the face of Fleming's hostility. "Actually, there's quite a bit more evidence than that. For instance, the serial numbers on the bills found in Sarah's cottage match perfectly with the numbers from a cash withdrawal you made from your business account 3 days before the church money disappeared. I confirmed this with the bank records." This revelation hit Fleming like a physical blow. His construction company's financial records had been subpoenaed during the investigation, but no one had thought to compare the serial numbers of the planted evidence with his recent transactions. It was exactly the kind of detail that Marcus's methodical investigation style uncovered. "You see," Marcus continued, addressing the crowd as much as the sheriff, "this wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was a carefully planned frame-up that took weeks to orchestrate. Janet needed someone to blame for her theft, and Sarah was the perfect target. A quiet woman with no powerful family connections, someone who wouldn't have the resources to fight back effectively." Danny Fleming, still in the deputy's custody, suddenly spoke up. His voice was choked with emotion as he looked toward Sarah in the stocks. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never wanted this to happen. My uncle said we were just borrowing the money, that no one would get hurt. I didn't know they were going to frame you for it." The crowd turned their attention to the young man, many recognizing him as someone they had known since childhood. Danny had always been quiet and easily influenced, working whatever jobs his uncle could provide him. It was becoming clear that he had been as much a victim of manipulation as Sarah herself. "Danny," Sheriff Garrett said gently, "tell us what happened. Tell us the truth." Through tears, Danny began to confess the full scope of the conspiracy. He explained how his uncle had pressured him to help, claiming that the family business was about to fail and that dozens of workers would lose their jobs if they couldn't get emergency funding. Janet Morrison had approached Robert Fleming with the scheme, offering to split the stolen money in exchange for his help in framing someone else for the crime. Aunt Janet said Sarah was perfect because she lived alone and didn't have anyone who would fight for her, Danny revealed, his words causing a collective gasp of horror from the crowd. "She made me watch Sarah's cottage for weeks, learning her schedule, finding out when she would be away so we could plant the evidence." As Danny's confession continued, the full cruelty of the conspiracy became apparent. They had chosen Sarah not because of any evidence of guilt, but because of her vulnerability. Her parents were dead, she had no siblings, and her quiet nature meant she had few close friends who might investigate the charges against her. The technical knowledge required to disable the security cameras had come from Danny's part-time work installing security systems for his uncle's construction projects. He had studied the church's system for weeks, learning exactly how to create a malfunction that would appear accidental while providing the perfect window for the theft. Sheriff Garrett unlocked the stocks, freeing Sarah for the first time in over an hour. She stood on unsteady legs, her arms aching from the restraints, but feeling a surge of relief and vindication that was overwhelming. The crowd watched in silence as she rubbed her sore wrists, many of them beginning to realize the magnitude of the injustice they had almost participated in. "Sarah," the sheriff said formally, "on behalf of the town of Millbrook and its legal system, I offer you our deepest apologies. You have been the victim of a serious crime, and we nearly compounded that injustice with our actions today." Mayor Williams stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "This is a travesty. Our entire community has been deceived and manipulated. Sarah, we owe you more than just an apology." The crowd began to murmur agreement, many people calling out their own apologies and expressions of shame. Mrs. Henderson, the bakery owner who had glared at Sarah with such contempt just an hour earlier, pushed through the crowd with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Sarah, honey," she said, reaching out to embrace the young woman. "I'm so sorry. I should have known better. I've watched you grow up, and nothing about this made sense. I should have trusted what I knew about your character." Similar scenes played out throughout the crowd as neighbors and former friends came forward to apologize and express their regret for doubting Sarah's innocence. The woman who had thrown the rotten tomato was particularly distraught, begging forgiveness for her actions. Marcus gathered his evidence and prepared to hand everything over to the sheriff for the formal investigation that would follow. The recorded confession, combined with the physical evidence and Danny's testimony, would be more than enough to convict Janet Morrison and Robert Fleming of multiple serious crimes. "There's one more thing," Marcus said to the gathered crowd. "The original $15,000 is still intact. Janet buried it in a different location, planning to retrieve it after the investigation was closed and suspicion had permanently settled on Sarah. I can lead you to it whenever you're ready." This news brought a cheer from the crowd, as many of them had donated significant amounts to the Church Restoration Fund. The knowledge that their contributions hadn't actually been lost was welcome news on a day that had already brought so many revelations. Father McKenna, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd in horrified silence, stepped forward to address the gathering. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position and the weight of the moment. "Today we have learned a valuable lesson about the importance of patience, investigation, and the presumption of innocence. We came very close to committing a grievous sin against one of our own." The priest turned to Sarah, who was still surrounded by apologetic neighbors. "Sarah, I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us. You have shown grace under pressure that puts us all to shame." Sarah looked out over the crowd. These people who had known her all her life, who had turned against her so quickly when presented with convincing evidence, but who were now genuinely remorseful for their actions. She felt anger, certainly, but also a deep sadness for how easily a community could be manipulated when fear and certainty replaced careful thought and investigation. "I forgive you all," she said simply, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "But I hope we can all learn from this. I hope we can remember that evidence can be manufactured, that people we trust can sometimes betray that trust, and that rushing to judgment helps no one." As the crowd began to disperse, many people stopping to speak personally with Sarah and offer their support, Marcus packed up his equipment and prepared to leave. His work was done, and the authorities would handle the prosecution of the real criminals. Sarah approached him as he was loading his truck. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved my life today. If you hadn't found that evidence—" Marcus smiled, the first time she had seen him show any emotion other than determined professionalism. "I was just looking for a lost cat," he said. "Sometimes the truth finds you when you're not even looking for it." 3 months later, Janet Morrison and Robert Fleming were sentenced to significant prison terms for theft, conspiracy, and fraud. Danny Fleming received a suspended sentence and community service in recognition of his cooperation and his status as a victim of manipulation by his uncle. The Church Restoration Fund was restored to its full amount, and the community completed the repairs to their historic building. Sarah Matthews received a formal public apology from the town council and a significant financial settlement for the trauma she had endured. More importantly, She regained her reputation and her place in the community. The experience had changed her, making her stronger and more assertive, but also more aware of how quickly public opinion could shift. Marcus Stone gained a reputation as someone who could uncover the truth when others had given up hope. His business expanded beyond finding lost pets to handling more serious investigations, and he became known throughout the region as someone who never stopped looking until he found what he was searching for. The stocks in Millbrook's town square were permanently removed and donated to a museum, with a plaque installed in their place commemorating the importance of justice, patience, and the presumption of innocence. The town had learned a valuable lesson about mob justice and the importance of thorough investigation before rushing to judgment. Sarah often thought about that terrible day when she came so close to being permanently marked as a criminal. The physical pain of the branding would have faded, but the social stigma would have followed her for the rest of her life. Thanks to one observant man looking for a lost cat, the truth had emerged just in time. The real criminals had been caught, justice had been served, and an innocent woman had been saved from a lifetime of undeserved shame. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, the most important discoveries happen when you least expect them, and heroes come in the most unlikely forms.